Patricia Schmidt, who was affectionately known by the nickname Susie, lived together with her family in the seaside suburb of Seacliff, situated just south of Adelaide in the state of South Australia. This was back in the month of December in the year 1971. At that time, the 16-year-old Susie had only recently completed her final leaving examinations at Seacom High School a mere few weeks earlier. From a young age, Susie had held onto a vivid dream of one day working as an airline hostess, flying off to exciting destinations around the world. In the meantime, while she saved up and planned for her future, she had accepted a temporary position at the Burger King restaurant located in Darlington. The job was specifically chosen so that she could earn extra money to buy thoughtful Christmas presents for every member of her family. Susie's 10-year-old brother, Frank, had already gone out and purchased a special gift for his big sister, which he had carefully wrapped and placed beneath the family's Christmas tree in eager anticipation. Tragically, Susie would never have the chance to open that present or share in the holiday joy with her loved ones. Susie had recently begun requesting late-night shifts at work because those hours came with higher pay rates, which would help her reach her savings goals even faster. Friday, December 17, 1971, marked only the second time she had ever worked one of those late shifts. That evening, Susie's father, Werner Schmidt, dropped her off at the home of her close friend Frida at approximately 6 p.m. on his way to the local German club, where he held a part-time job as a barman. Around 8:30 p.m., Susie and Frida walked together to the Burger King so that Susie could begin her shift. Before Frida headed home, Susie told her friend that she would see her again the next day. Susie finished her work duties around 1:45 a.m. on the morning of December 18th. Her father had planned to pick her up on his way home from the club, but he ended up running about 10 minutes behind schedule. Rather than wait any longer in the dark, Susie decided to set off walking toward home on her own. Reflecting on that brief delay years later, Werner Schmidt would tell members of the press with deep regret, "A few minutes could have made all the difference. I might have saved my daughter's life." Susie never made it back to the family home that night. Her worried father reported her missing at 9:30 a.m. the following morning, less than 8 hours after she had last been seen leaving work. That same evening, around 6:30 p.m., an off-duty police officer happened to be driving through the area of Howlett Cove when something unusual caught his eye among the tall grass lining the roadside. As he pulled over and approached for a closer look, he realized with horror that what he had spotted was the body of a young woman. It was Susie Schmidt. When rescuers and investigators reached her, Susie was found wearing nothing except her boots. Her bra was discovered hanging from a nearby fence post, while her jumper and coat had been carefully draped over her body, almost as if someone had attempted to cover her after the fact. The kangaroo skin purse she had been carrying with her that night was never located despite extensive searches. Forensic evidence at the scene clearly indicated that Susie had been sexually assaulted before she was murdered, and the severely battered condition of her body left no doubt that she had endured a violent and brutal death. Susie was laid to rest beside her mother, who had passed away 5 years earlier. From the very beginning, police investigators theorized that Susie may have accepted a ride home from the person who ultimately killed her. They had reason to consider this possibility because Susie had confided in a friend about an unsettling encounter just a few days earlier. On Tuesday, December 14th, after working her very first late-night shift, she had accepted a lift from an unattractive man who appeared to be around 30 years old and who suffered from severe acne. Once Susie was inside his car, the man suggested they take a detour for a drive through the Adelaide Hills, but Susie firmly refused. He then began heading in the direction of Howlett Cove instead of taking her straight home, prompting Susie to demand that he turn around and drive her directly back to her residence, which he eventually did. Authorities could not determine with certainty whether this same individual might have offered Susie a ride again on the fatal night of December 17th, or whether he could have played any role in her killing. They also remained unsure if Susie had willingly climbed into a vehicle with someone she knew or trusted, or if she had been forcibly abducted while walking home alone. Despite the uncertainty surrounding exactly how the killer encountered Susie, investigators did possess several tangible pieces of physical evidence recovered from the crime scene. Among these clues were microscopic metal filings consistent with those produced during key-cutting operations, as well as tiny particles that could have originated from a shoe repair business. There were also byproducts typically left behind by welding work, along with small fragments of electrical waste that matched materials used at Phillips Industries, a factory located in the nearby suburb of Henley Beach at the time. Additionally, forensic teams found flakes of iridescent blue paint that appeared to have come from a 1971 model Holden Monero, and other small paint chips that were pink on one side and white on the other. Although detectives pursued every one of these leads diligently in the weeks and months that followed, none of them immediately cracked the case or led to an arrest. It would take many decades before modern forensic technology could be applied more effectively to the evidence preserved from the scene. In December of 2021, on the solemn occasion of the 50th anniversary of Susie's murder, South Australia Police launched a fresh public appeal for information and announced what they described as a significant breakthrough that brought them closer to solving the case than at any previous point in the investigation. During a new and more thorough examination of the clothing that had been found with Susie's body, forensic scientists had successfully recovered DNA belonging to multiple men. So far, only one of the two distinct DNA profiles identified on the clothing had been fully developed into a usable genetic profile. Investigators immediately began using this profile in an attempt to identify at least one of the men believed to have been responsible for the sexual assault. The profile was uploaded to the National DNA Database, but it did not produce any direct matches among known offenders. Police then turned to the more advanced technique of familial searching, which has so far identified 8 potential relatives of the unknown suspect. Although this represents a major step forward, the painstaking process of constructing detailed family trees and obtaining DNA samples from every potential match is expected to take considerable time. In the meantime, authorities continue to urge anyone with information to come forward with the name of a possible suspect so that a direct DNA comparison can be conducted, which could potentially resolve the case within just a few weeks. A substantial reward of up to $1 million has been offered to encourage tips that might finally bring justice for Susie. For Susie's younger brother Frank, these latest developments have rekindled a long-dormant sense of optimism after decades of waiting and wondering. In a heartfelt statement, Frank expressed, "You're better off having some hope and being disappointed than having no hope at all." Friday, October 29, 1993, turned out to be an especially festive and joyful day for the students and staff at Eureka Elementary School in Granite Bay, California. The entire school was celebrating Halloween with a full schedule of fun activities that included going from classroom to classroom for trick-or-treating and participating in a lively fall festival filled with games, treats, and decorations. Once the day's celebrations finally wound down and all the students had gone home, 5th grade teacher Sharon Hockley remained behind at the school to help clean up the aftermath of the festivities. She was last observed tidying up scattered popcorn around 4:30 p.m., and when the school's janitor stepped outside to the parking lot at 5:30 p.m., he noticed that Sharon's minivan was still parked in its usual spot. However, when the janitor returned to the lot around 6 p.m., the minivan was no longer there. Sharon never made it home that evening, and her boyfriend quickly grew concerned when he could not reach her. He drove to the school to search for her but found no trace of her there. After checking with Sharon's family to see if anyone had heard from her, he ultimately reported her missing to the authorities. It was not until the night of the very holiday she had spent celebrating with her students, Halloween itself, that Sharon would be located. A deputy sheriff out on routine patrol spotted Sharon's Dodge Caravan minivan pulled off to the side of East Roseville Parkway in a wooded, somewhat secluded area. The location was less than a mile away from Eureka Elementary School, where Sharon had last been seen alive, and curiously, the van was parked within clear view of another local elementary school known as Oak Hills. Tragically, Sharon's body was discovered inside the back seat of her own vehicle. She was only 39 years old at the time of her death. Sharon had been navigating a period of significant personal transition in the months leading up to the murder. She had recently gone through a divorce after 15 years of marriage to her ex-husband, with whom she shared 3 children, 2 daughters, and 1 son. Sharon had applied for the teaching position at Eureka Elementary following the end of her marriage, and she had been overjoyed when she was selected for the role out of a large pool of applicants. Her daughter Heather, who was just 14 years old when her mother was killed, would later describe Sharon as the best mother ever. According to Heather, Sharon was a loving, energetic, and vibrant woman who filled their home with laughter and warmth. Mother and daughter shared a special bond over their mutual love of Whitney Houston. They would often blast her music while driving in the car or cleaning the house, singing or lip-syncing along at the top of their lungs. Sharon's naturally caring and affectionate personality, which made her such an outstanding mother, also allowed her to form quick and meaningful connections with her students. Even decades after the tragedy, the children who had been in her 5th grade class that year still spoke enthusiastically about what a wonderful, engaging, and inspiring teacher she had been. Heather later expressed how proud she had felt watching her mother land the teaching job at Eureka Elementary because so many qualified people had competed for the same position. The autopsy conducted on Sharon determined that she had died as a result of ligature strangulation. She was found partially clothed, but laboratory tests intended to establish whether she had been sexually assaulted returned inconclusive results. Investigators concluded that Sharon had most likely been killed on the night of October 29th. The same evening she disappeared. Robbery did not appear to have been a factor in the crime, because her purse and several other personal belongings were still inside the van when it was discovered. Sharon's boyfriend and her ex-husband were both thoroughly investigated early on but were quickly eliminated as suspects, as were her colleagues at the school. However, detectives emphasized from the outset that they did not believe Sharon had been targeted by a complete stranger. As Placer County Sheriff's Detective Brian Madison stated in 2016, when the case first started, there was definitely a sense that it was probably somebody who at least knew her, somebody familiar with the area, and to a large extent that remains true today. During the initial investigation, witnesses reported seeing an unidentified individual sitting inside a Volkswagen Beetle parked near Sharon's school on the day of the murder, October 29th. Authorities followed up on that lead extensively, but it ultimately yielded no useful information or suspects. Police also explored the possibility that Sharon's death might be connected to another unsolved murder in the region, that of 35-year-old Cindy Warner, who had been killed in November of 1991. Like Sharon, Cindy had been strangled to death and had disappeared from Granite Bay under somewhat similar circumstances. Cindy had been visiting her sister's house with her 11-month-old daughter when her sister and brother-in-law left the home for a short time. When Cindy's husband arrived approximately 45 minutes later, Cindy's car, jacket, and shoes were still at the residence, but Cindy herself was gone. Her infant daughter had been left unattended but unharmed in her high chair. 19 days after she vanished, Cindy's body was found by a quail hunter off Forest Hill Road east of Auburn. She was discovered face down among some trees and was wearing only a bra. Tests for sexual assault again proved inconclusive. Unlike Sharon, however, Cindy had apparently been kept alive somewhere for roughly 2 weeks before she was murdered. In 2017, it was reported that Cindy's case remained under active investigation by the Placer County Sheriff's Office, which still possessed a large volume of physical evidence but continued to seek witnesses who could help place that evidence into proper context. Ultimately, after careful comparison of the two cases, investigators working on Sharon's murder determined that the differing circumstances and distinct behavioral patterns exhibited by the respective killers made it unlikely that the same person was responsible for both deaths. In 2015, the Placer County Sheriff's Office launched a major renewed effort to solve Sharon's case once and for all. They resubmitted numerous items of evidence, including the robe they believed had been used to strangle her, to the crime laboratory, hoping that advancements in forensic technology would finally yield new clues or perhaps even the DNA profile of the perpetrator. While awaiting the results of that advanced testing, detectives also pursued more traditional investigative methods. They revisited the exact location where Sharon's body and vehicle had been discovered, re-interviewed every available witness, and painstakingly reviewed the thousands of pages of documents that comprised the massive case file. Detective Chris Joyce expressed confidence in 2016 that he already knew the identity of the person responsible for Sharon's murder and was optimistic that the new laboratory testing would produce DNA evidence capable of conclusively linking that individual to the crime. Unfortunately, despite the renewed push and the application of cutting-edge forensic techniques, the effort did not uncover any new evidence strong enough to result in an arrest at that time. Even so, investigators remain hopeful that the substantial body of evidence already collected will prove sufficient to secure a conviction if the correct suspect can ever be positively identified. They believe the perpetrator has already surfaced somewhere within the scope of the original investigation, and that continued work will eventually allow them to pinpoint the right person. In memory of Sharon and the lasting impact she had on her students, a permanent memorial was established at Eureka Elementary School. The memorial bears the names of every child who had been in her class that year. The students had all insisted on being included so that their beloved teacher would never be forgotten. Just after 6 p.m. on March 6, 1974, police officers in Hopewell Township, Pennsylvania, received an urgent call directing them to Lakewood Park. The caller had noticed what they initially mistook for a mannequin lying in a shallow creek that ran through the park. Upon closer inspection, however, the officers realized they were looking at the partially clothed body of a young woman whose face was submerged in the water. The victim was quickly identified as 23-year-old Annette Tokars. According to Annette's younger sister Sharon, Annette had always been an exceptionally friendly and compassionate person who would readily give away her last dollar if she believed someone else needed it more. Annette and Sharon had spoken on the phone about a week before Annette's death, and even then Sharon could sense that something was weighing heavily on her sister's mind. Annette had not shared any details about what was troubling her, leaving the family with unanswered questions long after the tragedy. The injuries documented on Annette's body during the autopsy made it clear that she had been physically assaulted before she died. A wooden club was recovered during the thorough search of the park, but forensic analysis later confirmed that it had not been the weapon used to inflict her injuries. The official cause of death was determined to be forceful drowning. Authorities believed Annette had been attacked elsewhere and then dragged down to the creek by her assailant, who held her face in just a few inches of water until she suffocated. Investigators theorized that she may have already been unconscious by the time she was placed in the creek. Police also developed the theory that Annette had willingly accompanied her killer to the park, possibly because she knew and trusted the person. The autopsy further revealed that Annette had engaged in sexual activity prior to her death, but examiners could not definitively determine whether that activity had been consensual or the result of rape. In the hours leading up to the discovery of her body, Annette had been seen out and about in several different locations throughout the surrounding area the previous night. Detectives interviewed numerous witnesses in an attempt to reconstruct Annette's movements during the final hours of her life. The last confirmed sighting of Annette placed her in the town of Aliquippa, which lies just a few miles north of Lakewood Park. She was observed being driven away in the car of a man who was already known to her as an acquaintance. For many decades afterward, that particular man remained the prime suspect in the eyes of the police, although they were never able to gather sufficient evidence to charge him with the murder. In 2022, Beaver County Detective Paul Young conducted an exhaustive re-examination of every piece of evidence connected to Annette's case, searching meticulously for any details that might have been overlooked in the past. Using an alternative light source during this review, he located previously undetected DNA evidence on what was later described to the media as an appropriate area of Annette's clothing. This discovery opened up a promising new pathway toward identifying her killer. Unfortunately, because the biological material had been exposed to the elements since 1974, the DNA profile that was ultimately developed was only partial and therefore not complete enough to be uploaded into the National Combined DNA Index System for an automatic search. Even so, investigators were still able to perform direct comparisons between the partial profile and reference samples collected from various persons of interest. The main suspect, the acquaintance Annette had last been seen with, had since passed away, but one of his relatives voluntarily provided a DNA sample. Testing conclusively showed that the prime suspect himself could not have been the source of the DNA found on Annette's clothing. The partial profile was then compared against samples taken from a suspected local serial killer who had been active in the region at the time, as well as against known sex offenders who lived or operated in the area during the mid-1970s. None of these comparisons produced a match. Although the DNA profile remains too incomplete for a standard criminal database search, it is sufficiently detailed to allow for genetic genealogy testing, which can trace family relationships through public DNA databases and help construct family trees that might lead investigators to the unknown contributor. Crime Solvers of Beaver County has generously agreed to cover the costs of this specialized testing. Detectives and the victim's family continue to hold out hope that this latest scientific approach will soon reveal the identity of Annette's killer and finally bring long overdue justice to the case. Kolu Hig, who also goes by the name Kai, was born in Maui, the island paradise where his parents first met and fell in love. His mother is Hawaiian, deeply rooted in the island's rich culture and traditions, while his father is Caucasian and originally from California. Kai was only 7 years old when his parents' marriage came to an end through divorce. Following the separation, he, along with his brother and younger sister, relocated to California to live with their father. Over the years that followed, Kai grew exceptionally close to his father's side of the family, forming strong bonds and creating lasting memories on the mainland. However, as a teenager, he ultimately felt the pull of his Hawaiian roots and decided to return to Maui. Even after making that move back home, he remained committed to maintaining a close and loving relationship with his family in California, often staying in touch and visiting whenever he could. In 2003, when Kai was 22 years old, he met the woman who would become his wife, Samantha. Their meeting was simple yet memorable. Kai kindly pointed out to her that she had dropped a $5 bill. Samantha was instantly smitten, completely drawn to Kai's laid-back, easygoing, and fun-loving personality that seemed to light up any room he entered. The couple dated, fell deeply in love, and got married in 2005. Together they built a family, welcoming 3 children into their lives. They settled down in a small, close-knit town on Maui, where Kai began working in landscaping. He quickly became a favorite among the owners of the properties he cared for, known for his reliability, cheerful attitude, and the genuine care he put into every job. Kai is remembered as a dedicated and loving father who cherished every moment spent with his children. He regularly took them on exciting outdoor excursions, including hunting, spearfishing, and hiking through Maui's breathtaking landscapes. These adventures were more than just activities. They were opportunities for him to bond with his kids, teach them about nature, and create memories that would last a lifetime. While Kai enjoyed a warm and supportive family life filled with love, not every aspect of his world was without challenges. He had struggled with a history of substance abuse, a battle he fought privately while trying to be the best husband and father he could be. On May 6, 2022, Kai relapsed after having stayed clean for several months. Concerned for their children and not wanting them to see him while he was under the influence, his wife Samantha asked him to leave the family home they shared. In previous instances when he had been using, Kai would typically go stay with his mother at her home in Lahaina or at a nearby rental property while he worked to sober up. This time was no different at first. His mother would end up being the last person to see Kai before he vanished. On the night of May 7th, around 11:30 p.m., Kai hugged his mother tightly, handed her his phone, and wished her a happy Mother's Day, knowing the holiday was the very next day. After that warm goodbye, he has not been seen or heard from again. Kai was formally reported missing on May 12, 2022. The same day, his white Toyota Tacoma pickup truck was discovered abandoned in a parking garage on Front Street near the Lahaina harbor. The vehicle had actually been spotted at that location as early as May 8th. Strikingly, the truck had been left unlocked, and Kai's wallet, still containing his driver's license, credit cards, and debit cards, was sitting openly on the front seat. According to Samantha, abandoning the truck in such a careless manner was completely out of character for Kai. He had worked incredibly hard to purchase the vehicle and took great pride in it, often referring to it as a symbol of his dedication and responsibility. Even more heartbreaking and uncharacteristic was the fact that Kai missed his son's high school graduation on May 19th. He had been looking forward to the milestone for a long time, as he deeply loved his son and took immense joy in celebrating his children's achievements. Kai's family has grown increasingly frustrated with the way the Maui Police Department has handled the investigation into his disappearance. Samantha has shared that some of the comments made by investigating officers felt heartless to her, with remarks suggesting that her husband was probably just off somewhere doing drugs. Kai had had minor run-ins with law enforcement in the past, and his wife believes this history may have caused police to downplay or disregard the seriousness of his vanishing. While Samantha openly acknowledges that her husband made some poor choices in his life, she emphasizes that those mistakes do not define him or diminish the fact that he is fundamentally a good person. She remains convinced that something serious has happened to him and that his disappearance is not voluntary. Despite the official investigation, Kai's family has not given up. They continue to search for him actively on their own, putting up flyers across the island, reaching out to the community, and even attempting to hire a private investigator to supplement the police efforts. The emotional toll on the family has been profound. Kai's oldest son, for instance, no longer sleeps in his own bedroom. Instead, he stays in the living room each night, waiting and hoping that his father will walk through the door at any moment. At the time of his disappearance, 41-year-old Kai stood 6 feet tall. He has a number of traditional Hawaiian tattoos that hold deep personal and cultural significance. He was last seen wearing a white shirt and dark-colored board shorts. Adding another layer of complexity to any potential sightings is the fact that Kai and his brother are identical twins, meaning the two men are often mistaken for one another, which could make it difficult for witnesses to be certain if they saw Kai or his sibling. Kai's loved ones continue to hold out hope and plead for any information that might help bring him home safely, refusing to let his story fade into the background. 56-year-old John Lazaro lived in Rochdale, a suburb south of Brisbane, on April 11, 2012. He was in the living room of his home when 2 masked men burst inside and shot him multiple times. His 19-year-old daughter witnessed the shooting, but was not harmed during the attack. She was able to immediately call for help, but despite her quick action, her father did not survive his injuries. John's dog, a Rottweiler mix named Kilo, was also shot during the attack but survived after undergoing surgery. Police would later describe John's murder as a brutal execution. While his murderers clearly targeted him, investigators could find no motive for the crime despite interviewing more than 150 individuals in connection to their investigation. Years went on without an arrest in John's case. Police made a renewed appeal to the public for information in April of 2022 on the 10th anniversary of John's murder. At this time, they also released CCTV footage taken near John's home at the time of the murder. The footage shows a Trayback utility vehicle speeding away. The footage was taken less than 100 yards away from John's home, just moments after the time he was shot. Due to how quickly the vehicle left the scene, investigators believe that at least 3 people were involved in the crime: the 2 shooters and a getaway driver. A major break in the case came just months later, in June of 2022, when authorities announced that they had located the gun used to kill John. Ballistics testing had confirmed that it was the weapon used in the case. The firearm in question was an unregistered Browning 1932 caliber semi-automatic. The 45-year-old man from New South Wales who had been in possession of the gun was questioned by authorities, and his home was searched. The weapon had been in the possession of numerous individuals since 2012, making it difficult to tie it to the person responsible for John's murder. However, Detective Acting Inspector Daniel Cunningham has stated that the discovery of the weapon has accelerated the investigation. Inquiries into the various individuals who had been in possession of the weapon are ongoing. When announcing the discovery of the gun, Queensland Police also stated that they now believe that the shooters had ties to the Bandito outlaw motorcycle gang. John himself was not involved with the gang. Investigators are hoping that the quickly shifting loyalties amongst gangs like the Banditos will result in someone with information finally coming forward. There is a $500,000 reward being offered for information that ties all of the new clues and information together to finally solve John's case. Harvey Eugene Whitaker, who went by the nickname Gene, was born in Connorsville, Indiana, on October 6, 1926. He was a very responsible and disciplined young man who grew up on a farm with a large, close-knit group of siblings. Gene worked as a typesetter for the local newspaper, learning the value of hard work and reliability from an early age. Shortly after graduating from high school, he joined the United States Army and quickly rose through the ranks, achieving the position of corporal in less than 2 years, an impressive accomplishment that spoke to his dedication and character. In the summer of 1947, 20-year-old Gene was serving in the Engineer Corps and had been assigned to the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project at the top-secret Sandia Base, located on the outskirts of Albuquerque, New Mexico. On the morning of July 1, 1947, Gene failed to report for roll call. This immediately raised serious concerns among his superiors because Gene was known as an exceptionally dependable soldier who could never be imagined abandoning his duties. He did not smoke or drink, and he had never gone absent without leave before. The previous evening, Gene had spent time at a bowling alley in Albuquerque with an Army bowling league. He was an above-average bowler, and because he was so trustworthy, he had been chosen as the treasurer of the league. 2 days after Gene disappeared, some of his personal belongings, his glasses, shirt, hat, and necktie, were discovered in an alley near the bowling alley. The shirt was stained with blood, and tears in the fabric suggested that Gene may have been stabbed twice in the back while he was still wearing it. Although these items had been found, there was still no trace of Gene himself or of his body. It was estimated that Gene had been carrying between $400 and $500 with him that night because of his role as the league treasurer. The fact that his body had not been left behind, even if he had been killed during what might have appeared to be a simple robbery, combined with his sensitive military position, led investigators to worry that his disappearance might have had national security implications. The Armed Forces Special Weapons Project had taken over atomic weapons development from the Manhattan Project after World War II, and Sandia was a highly classified base. Gene potentially had access to important and sensitive information. This raised fears that he might have been abducted by someone hoping to extract top-secret details about the base or its projects. Gene had reportedly performed work connected to the top-secret guided missile program, and spy activities had recently been uncovered at the nearby Los Alamos base. As a result, the FBI joined local and military authorities in a thorough investigation of the disappearance. The War Department eventually dismissed the idea that Gene possessed information valuable enough to kill for, but the FBI continued to investigate the case actively for several more years. Investigators also explored the possibility that Gene had simply deserted. They questioned his family members and even tapped their phones, hoping to catch any evidence of Gene attempting to contact them. The last known piece of correspondence between Gene and his family was a letter he had sent to his sister Rose, dated June 23rd, exactly 1 week before he vanished. Gene's bank account back in Indiana was carefully monitored, but it was never touched. In January 1954, Gene was officially declared legally dead. Many, but not all, of his relatives eventually accepted the theory that he had been murdered during a robbery. However, his niece Patty Mawson has never been satisfied with that explanation. She believes the circumstances surrounding her uncle's disappearance are highly suspicious and continues to work on the case to this day. Patty is deeply upset that all of Gene's siblings passed away without ever learning what happened to him, and she is frustrated that he is still technically listed by the Army as a deserter and AWOL. She has filed a Freedom of Information Act request to obtain files from the FBI about the case and was told that approximately 200 pages from his file are available, although certain information will be redacted in the copies she receives. Unfortunately, she has already been waiting more than 3 years to receive those documents and has been informed that there are currently 485 other requests ahead of hers that must be processed first. The personal items of Gene's that were found in the alley, his glasses, shirt, hat, and necktie, also appear to have gone missing over the decades. They were never properly logged into evidence with the police in Albuquerque, and federal agencies have no record of their current whereabouts. In addition to seeking answers about what truly happened to her uncle, Patty hopes to locate these missing items. If she is unable to honor her uncle by finding his remains and giving him a proper burial, she hopes at least to bury these personal belongings so that there will finally be a physical location where Gene can be remembered and memorialized. In the summer of 2009, 28-year-old David Gimel-Farb felt he needed some time to relax and recharge before the demands of another demanding academic year took over. He was working toward his doctorate degree and was preparing to begin his 4th year of graduate school at the Adler School of Professional Psychology in Chicago. In addition to his studies, David volunteered as a counselor at a community health center on the west side of the city. Although he was passionate about making counseling his lifelong career, he recognized that the work was inherently stressful and emotionally draining. On top of everything else, David was still coping with the recent death of his beloved grandmother, Valentina, who had helped raise him from the time he was an infant until he started kindergarten. The loss had hit him hard, and one of his mother's co-workers suggested that a trip to Costa Rica might be the perfect way for him to find some peace and perspective. The destination seemed ideal for David. He was fluent in Spanish, an experienced hiker, and the country offered countless beautiful trails for him to explore. David decided that some time alone in nature would do him a world of good before classes resumed, so he planned a solo trip to Costa Rica. Solo travel was nothing new for him. He had taken a similar hiking adventure to Hawaii by himself just the year before. Spending quiet time alone in nature also aligned perfectly with David's introspective and somewhat reserved personality. Those traits may have stemmed in part from his early childhood, when he started kindergarten and struggled to speak English with his classmates because he was so used to communicating in Russian with his parents and grandmother at home. Over time, David grew a bit less reserved, especially once he began college at Beloit College and joined a fraternity. He developed a wry sense of humor, maintained a positive outlook on life, and showed a real talent for writing thoughtful essays on deep, philosophical topics. David's 6-day trip to Costa Rica began on August 9, 2009. As his parents' only child, he stayed in daily contact with them whether he was at home in Illinois or traveling abroad. On August 10th, he spoke with his mother, Luda, from his room at the Hotel Hacienda del Sol in the Guanacaste province of northwest Costa Rica. He told her the hotel was farther from the beaches and other attractions he wanted to visit than he had expected, so he was thinking about switching to another hotel for part of his stay. He also mentioned that he had met a girl at the beach and hoped to see her again. When Luda asked for more details, David would only say that she seemed very nice. He informed his mother that the next day, August 11th, he planned to spend hiking in the nearby Rincon de la Vieja National Park. The following evening, however, he never called to tell her how the hike had gone, as she had expected. By 10 p.m., Luda had grown concerned enough to try calling him, but there was no answer. The next morning, she phoned the hotel's front desk, only to be told that David was not answering his room phone either. Luda insisted that staff check inside her son's room. Several hours later, the hotel owner called her back with worrying news. It did not appear that David had slept in his room the previous night. His suitcase was still there, but the rental car he had been using was found parked at the national park where he had planned to hike. Luda and her husband, Roma, immediately arranged to fly to Costa Rica to search for their son. By the time they arrived the next day, search efforts were already underway. Volunteers from the Red Cross were combing the national park on foot. Other hikers had gone missing in the park in the past, but all of them had eventually been found safe. Witnesses confirmed that David had been seen eating breakfast at his hotel around 9 a.m. on August 11th and had signed in at the national park shortly before 10 a.m. He had told the park ranger he would be hiking an easy, well-established loop trail that was less than 2 miles long and would take him past the park's famous thermal mud pots. Initial searches therefore focused on that loop. When David was not located, the search teams expanded in size and adjusted their strategy. Given that he was an experienced hiker, they considered the possibility that he might have decided on a more challenging route, perhaps hiking all the way up to the crater of the park's nearby volcano. That trek would take roughly 8 hours round trip, and sunset on August 11th had occurred around 6 p.m. If David had started after 10 a.m., he could easily have been caught in the dark and run into trouble. The crater itself was searched from the air, but nothing was found. The expanded search area likewise turned up no signs of David. While David's parents were in Costa Rica working tirelessly to find him, his friends and loved ones back in the United States were also doing everything they could to help. A Facebook group called Help Find David Gimel Farb was created and quickly grew to more than 1,000 members in just a few days. Because David's parents were not receiving the level of support they had hoped for from the American Embassy in Costa Rica, group members were urged to contact their elected representatives and ask for greater government assistance. David's friends also organized demonstrations in Chicago's Daily Plaza and outside local television stations, carrying signs that explained why David was so important to them. Their efforts helped draw media attention and, ultimately, more official help. On August 19th, the embassy dispatched 2 military helicopters equipped with infrared sensors to scan the dense vegetation of the national park from above, along with a dozen soldiers from Soto Cano Air Base in Honduras. Still, David was not located. As the days passed without any trace of him, concerns grew that David may have fallen victim to something more sinister than a simple hiking accident. Robberies inside the park were not uncommon, and certain sections had even been closed temporarily in 2009 and again in 2012 because visitors had been robbed at Machete Point. Because the park lay close to the border with Nicaragua, some of its more remote trails were known to be used by drug smugglers and poachers moving contraband across the border. This raised the grim possibility that David might have accidentally witnessed something illegal and been killed to keep him silent. Another theory suggested he could have inadvertently wandered onto private property bordering the park and been mistaken for a poacher or smuggler by a landowner. The park's proximity to Nicaragua also led some to speculate that David might have voluntarily crossed the border to start a new life, given the lower cost of living and lax immigration enforcement there. However, the circumstances and David's own behavior strongly contradicted that idea. The night before he disappeared, he had called a friend in Chicago to confirm dinner plans for after his return home. Although he was understandably sad about his grandmother's recent death, he was not depressed or in distress during the trip. In messages and conversations shortly before he vanished, it seemed that Valentina's passing had instead reminded him of life's brevity and inspired him to make the most of the time he had. The items David left behind in his hotel room further indicated he had no intention of disappearing for more than a day. Inside the room safe were his cell phone, his passport, and $600 in cash. He had arrived in Costa Rica with $800, and after accounting for his expenses, it is estimated he would have had only about $100 with him when he set out on the hike. He was believed to have been carrying only his backpack, a copy of his passport, water, protein bars, his journal, an inexpensive camera, and his wallet containing his driver's license, a few credit cards, and that small amount of cash. None of David's financial accounts have ever been accessed since he disappeared, and there is no evidence that he opened any new ones. When the disappearance was not quickly resolved, David's parents continued to travel to Costa Rica year after year, especially around the anniversary of his vanishing, to follow up on tips, meet with officials, and keep the case in the local media. Over the following years, various potential clues and sightings were reported to them. A stack of crayon drawings with a style strikingly similar to artwork David was known to create was found in an abandoned house in a nearby area, giving his parents brief hope that the artist might have crossed paths with their son. There have been several reported sightings of a man matching David's general description since 2009, but none have been confirmed. In February 2010, a local farmer said he saw a disheveled hiker who fled into the woods when approached. In 2012, an unkempt and confused man wandered into a mini-mart more than 200 miles from the park. A family who had seen a news report about David believed it was him and took the man to the police, but officers released him without even photographing him. In 2013, while David's parents were in Costa Rica, they received ransom demands and a dark photo supposedly of their son. Police later determined the extortion was a hoax originating from inside a prison. In 2018, a tip suggested David might have been treated at the National Psychiatric Hospital, but an investigator found no one matching his description. David's parents hired for private investigators to work on the case both in Costa Rica and from the United States. On November 6, 2009, Costa Rica's Organismo de Investigación Judicial formally closed its investigation despite the lack of resolution. By 2018, the case had been transferred to the agency's Department of Criminal Investigations in San Jose. David's parents, Roma and Luda, continued their annual trips to Costa Rica to ensure the case stayed alive in the media, to pursue leads, and to meet with officials from the American Embassy and the OIJ. They long believed their son might still be alive. In a 2018 interview, they vowed to keep making the journey every year until they were physically unable to travel. Sadly, Roma Gimel-Farb did not live to make the next trip. He passed away in March 2019 after a 4-year battle with cancer, though he had never let his illness stop him from searching for David. Luda Gimel-Farb remains deeply committed and active in the ongoing search for her son. A $100,000 reward is still being offered for any information that leads to the discovery of David's whereabouts. 17-year-old Yvonne Regler lived in Lorain, Ohio, and was a student at North Olmsted High School. Her best friend was her brother Dan, who was only a year older than her, and the two shared an especially close bond. On August 8, 1977, Yvonne reported for work at the Sunoco gas station on Lorraine Road in North Olmsted, Ohio. She had been there for only about an hour when she was asked to transfer to another station roughly 3 miles away in Fairview Park. The attendant working at the Fairview Park location that morning was also a mechanic, and his skills were urgently needed back at the North Olmsted station. Since Yvonne did not have a car, one of her co-workers drove her to the other station. At the time, the Fairview Park station was in the process of changing from full service to self-service. On that particular day, only one gas pump was operational and it still required full service. At 10:30 a.m., Yvonne spoke on the phone with one of her friends. They talked about the upcoming funeral they would both be attending for the father of another friend and about the dress Yvonne had bought for the service. Despite the somber subject, her friend later recalled that Yvonne sounded to be in good spirits. Yvonne then had a second phone conversation about the same funeral, this time with one of her family members. At 11 a.m., the manager from the North Olmsted station dropped off lunch for her. At noon, two teenage girls saw Yvonne at the gas station. Sometime between 12:30 and 1 p.m., she spoke on the phone with her friend again. The friend could hear the service bell ringing over the line, and Yvonne told her that a car had pulled in but then left. Moments later, the bell rang again, and Yvonne said the same car had returned. She told her friend she would call back after her shift ended at 3 p.m. Yvonne initialed a receipt at 1:25 p.m. when a customer paid for gas with a credit card. Between 1:30 and 2:05 p.m., 3 different people, 2 customers and a coffee machine repairman, stopped at the station and found no one there. None of them were particularly alarmed and none contacted the police. However, when the employee who was scheduled to relieve Yvonne arrived at 2:45 p.m., he became immediately concerned. Yvonne was nowhere to be seen, but her purse, her partially eaten lunch, her cigarettes, and her book were all still at the station. He quickly called over to the North Olmsted station, and the manager, who had seen Yvonne less than 3 hours earlier, rushed to the scene to help search. When the 2 men could not find her, they called the police at 3:30 p.m. There were no signs of a struggle inside the station, and $300 in cash remained untouched in the register. Police theorized that Yvonne had most likely been abducted while she was outside, possibly when she had gone out to pump gas for a customer. In the months and years that followed, investigators looked into more than 100 tips. Local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies all became involved. Numerous persons of interest were identified, but without finding Yvonne or her body, police could only speculate about what might have happened to her. The passage of time did not lessen the family's desperate need for answers. In 2014, one of Yvonne's relatives provided a DNA sample so that her remains could be identified if they were ever discovered. This step helped spark a renewed investigative effort. Police went back and re-interviewed every available witness. Then, in 2016, on the 39th anniversary of Yvonne's disappearance, the Fairview Park Police Department announced that, during this fresh review, they had identified a potential person of interest. The man was already known to police and had previously been linked to crimes similar in nature to Yvonne's case. Authorities made the information public in hopes that new witnesses might come forward with tips that could either confirm or eliminate his involvement. Unfortunately, the renewed appeal did not result in the case being solved. In 2021, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released an age-progressed image showing what Yvonne might look like at age 62. Even after more than 4 decades, her brother Dan continued to hold out hope for closure. In 2022, he said, "Everyone is doing what they need to be doing on the police side. On my side, all I can do is hope that there will be closure." 29-year-old VL Powers, who was known to her family and friends as Vita, was a dependable and hardworking employee at St. Thomas West Hospital in Nashville, Tennessee. She was also a devoted mother to 2 young children and shared an especially close bond with her extended family, always stepping up to help whenever anyone needed her. May 26, 1982, began as an ordinary day for Vita. She followed her usual morning routine, leaving her home on 9th Avenue South, dropping her children off at daycare, and then driving to her sister's house to pick her up and give her a ride to work at the Continental Insurance office. It was during this short drive that Vida first deviated from her normal schedule. She casually told her sister that she had taken the day off from the hospital and, after dropping her off, would be heading straight home to go back to bed and rest. Vida's sister would turn out to be the last person known to have seen her alive. When Vida failed to pick up her children from daycare that afternoon, an event that was completely out of character for the reliable mother, her family was immediately notified and a frantic search began. She was not at home, and neither was her car, an orange 1975 Chevrolet Monza. A formal missing person report was filed with the police on May 28th, and officers joined the family in looking for her. On May 30th, Vida's car was finally located, abandoned on 14th Street South near Edge Hill Avenue, just a few blocks from her home. According to police, the location seemed unusual, and it appeared as though someone had deliberately tried to conceal the vehicle so it would not be noticed right away. Inside the car, officers found Vida's purse and her eyeglasses. The discovery was deeply concerning because Vida had very poor eyesight and relied heavily on her glasses to see clearly. The fact that she had left them behind led investigators to believe that foul play was almost certainly involved in her disappearance. Police have long had a person of interest in the case, but they have never been able to gather enough evidence to conclusively link that individual to Vida's vanishing. For Vida's two children, the month of May remains an especially painful time each year, as it marks not only the anniversary of their mother's disappearance but also her birthday and Mother's Day. Vida's daughter Yolanda, who was only 9 years old when her mother went missing, has never stopped searching for answers. She continues to hope that anyone who knew her mother at the time or who might have even the smallest piece of information will come forward. In 2023, Yolanda expressed her quiet determination, saying, "I'm just keeping it positive. Every day the Lord wakes me up is a day for me to try and find her." Helen Anderson, who went by the nickname Nikki, was born on October 15, 1958, in South Bend, Indiana. At the beginning of 1986, the 27-year-old single mother was living in a duplex at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac on Magnolia Drive in Bremerton, Washington. She worked at a nearby Arby's restaurant and shared the home with her two young children, 4-year-old Adrian and 7-month-old Marcus. Adrian's father, Kenny Hale, has always described his daughter as a true gift from God. Even at such a young age, she had a charming smile and a strong personality. Kenny noted that Adrian was a very advanced child who could already spell her own name when she was only 2 years old. Although Kenny and Nikki's romantic relationship had not worked out, they remained committed co-parents and spent a great deal of time together with their daughter because of their deep love for her. In January 1986, Nikki was engaged to the father of her son Marcus. Her fiancé was serving in the United States Navy and was stationed in San Diego, California. She was in the process of packing up her home in preparation for moving to California to be near him. Adrian was going to stay temporarily in Washington with Kenny while her mother got settled before joining her later. On the evening of January 29th, Kenny stopped by Nikki's home after work to spend time with Adrian. When it was time for him to leave, Adrian asked if she could spend the night at his house. Kenny considered bringing her with him but ultimately decided against it. He did not want her to have to wake up extra early the next morning, so he could return her to Nikki's house and keep her on her usual schedule. He told his daughter he would see her the next day. Before he drove away, Adrian waved to him lovingly from the front window of the house. Kenny returned to the home on Magnolia Drive the following evening, January 30th, exactly as planned. He was surprised when no one answered his knock on the front door. Disappointed, he turned to leave, but as he did, he heard Nikki's infant son Marcus whimpering inside. Concerned, Kenny tried the front door and found it unlocked. He had trouble pushing it fully open because something inside was blocking the way. As he stepped into the dark house, he tripped over something on the floor. Reaching down, he grabbed what felt stiff, and his heart sank when he realized he was holding his daughter Adrienne's leg. In the dim light, he could see Adrian lying on the floor near the front door and Nikki lying farther inside the home. Kenny quickly grabbed baby Marcus, who was in a playpen just feet away from his mother, and ran next door to a neighbor's house to get help. While the neighbor called the police, Kenny rushed back to Adrian and began performing CPR on her, not knowing how long she had been there. Tragically, his desperate efforts could not save his little girl. It was later determined that both Adrian and Nikki had been dead for approximately 20 hours, meaning baby Marcus had been left alone in the house with their bodies for nearly a full day. Both Nikki and Adrian had been strangled to death. In addition, Nikki had suffered blows to the back of her head, and defensive wounds on her body showed that she had fought fiercely against her attacker. She had also been sexually assaulted, which police believed was the primary motive for the murders. Robbery did not appear to be a factor, because valuables that had been left out in plain sight were untouched. Adrian was found still in her pajamas, with the comforter from her bed nearby. Investigators theorized that she had been awakened by the sounds of the violent struggle between her mother and the killer. She had come into the living room to see what was happening and had apparently tried to escape through the front door. The killer caught her just before she reached it and murdered her because she was old enough to have seen him and could potentially identify him. 7-month-old Marcus was spared, police believed, simply because he was too young to describe or identify the attacker. The killer had placed the baby in the playpen along with a cushion taken from a nearby couch. Nikki's neighbor on the other side of the duplex said she had not heard anything unusual the night of the murders. Normally she could hear everyday noises through the shared wall, but on this night there were no screams or sounds of a struggle. She later mentioned that she had been suffering from an ear infection at the time, which may have dulled her hearing. She did hear Marcus crying throughout the following day, but she assumed they were just his normal cries for food or a clean diaper. 2 other witnesses in the neighborhood reported hearing a single scream that night but nothing more. On January 30th, several people, including an acquaintance, a co-worker, and a furniture salesman, came to the home looking for Nikki. Some of them stopped by multiple times, yet no one tried to open the front door until Kenny arrived that evening and heard Marcus crying. Nikki's fiancé was confirmed to have been on duty at his naval base in San Diego at the time of the murders, eliminating him as a suspect. Kenny Hale also had a solid alibi, but he remained under suspicion in the early days of the investigation. Police were skeptical of the peaceful co-parenting arrangement he had with Nikki, viewed her planned move to California as a possible motive, and knew he had regular access to the home. Kenny wanted to do everything possible to help the investigation and was shocked to learn he was being considered a suspect. His sister urged him to hire a lawyer, and although he initially saw no need, he followed her advice. That decision proved wise when police questioned him aggressively. Kenny agreed to take a voluntary polygraph examination, but his lawyer stopped the test midway through, pointing out that Kenny was still far too emotionally distraught for the results to be reliable. According to Kenny, after he left the police station that day, more than a decade would pass before he heard from investigators again. The case quickly went cold, though authorities had followed up on every lead they could identify in the first 6 to 8 months. A handful of potential suspects were looked at, including the boyfriend of one of Nikki's friends, a neighbor who had babysat Adrian, and a man whose car had been seen in the neighborhood that night. None of them could be linked to the crime. The investigation was reopened in 1993, 2003, 2009, and 2019, but none of those renewed efforts have led to an arrest. In later reviews, Kenny was contacted again and kept informed of the ongoing work. One major piece of evidence has remained central to the case. DNA believed to belong to the killer was recovered from the scene. The exact source of that DNA has never been publicly disclosed. Bremerton Police Detective Marty Garland, who has most recently overseen the investigation, has stated that it is unclear whether the sexual assault against Nikki was completed. A local newspaper reported in 2010 that a drop of blood not belonging to Nikki or Adrian had been found on Adrienne's nightgown, but this has not been officially confirmed as the source of the DNA. Unfortunately, the DNA profile developed from the evidence is incomplete. It is not detailed enough to be entered into criminal databases or used for genetic genealogy, so investigators can only compare it directly to samples taken from persons of interest they identify. All of the men known to have been close to Nikki, including Kenny Hale, have been tested and ruled out as contributors. There were no signs of forced entry into the home, and investigators do not believe Nikki would have opened her door in the middle of the night to a complete stranger. Since none of the people known to be associated with her matched the DNA, police theorized that the killer was someone Nikki knew well enough to let inside, but not so well that others in her life could immediately identify him. When contacted by different detectives over the years, Kenny did not always feel optimistic about their progress. However, when Detective Garland took over the case, Kenny sensed a renewed dedication. Garland has pursued numerous new avenues in recent years, including additional DNA testing, reviews of known serial killers, and even exploring the possibility of having Nikki's son Marcus, who was only 7 months old at the time, undergo hypnosis as an adult. Marcus is now in his 30s and lives in Mississippi, where his father, Nikki's fiancé at the time, also resides. Kenny Hale still struggles daily with the loss of his daughter and the brutal way her young life ended. He keeps albums filled with photographs he took of her, but sometimes he cannot bring himself to look through them entirely because the emotions become overwhelming. Although his romantic relationship with Nikki did not last, he still speaks of her as a beautiful person who did not deserve the violent death she suffered. He is determined to see justice for both Nikki and Adrian. As painful as it is to revisit the details, Kenny refuses to stop telling their story. In 2022, he told the Daily Beast, "It gets kind of hard to go back and relive the story, but as long as I got air in my lungs and I'm able to tell their story, I'll keep telling their story until I can't tell it no more." Jason Knapp was a native of York, Pennsylvania. He was hardworking, intelligent, and a true perfectionist from a very young age. Once, as a child in elementary school, he cried for 3 full days after receiving a bad grade on a test. As he grew older, that same commitment to excellence brought him success in many areas of life. He played 3 sports in high school, made plenty of friends to whom he was fiercely loyal, and was accepted into the mechanical engineering program at Clemson University in South Carolina. He was also a member of the ROTC and, in 1998, at the age of 20, was pledged into the National Society of Pershing Rifles, a national military honor society. Jason's hobbies likewise demanded skill and precision. He enjoyed target shooting and mountain biking. Jason normally called home to speak with his mother, Deborah, in Pennsylvania every single day. During their last conversation on Saturday, April 11, 1998, he excitedly told her about his recent induction into the Pershing Rifles and how he and a friend had been out looking for an apartment for the following school year. That would be the last time Deborah ever spoke to her son. When she did not receive any calls from him over the next few days, she assumed he was simply busy studying for the end of the semester and making housing arrangements. On April 17th, Deborah finally received a phone call, but it was not from Jason. One of his roommates informed her that no one had seen Jason all week. The last time anyone had seen him was the evening of April 11th, when his roommate noticed him watching a movie in their apartment. As soon as Deborah learned this, she immediately contacted police in South Carolina to report her son missing. Officers checked local hospitals and searched Jason's apartment. The following day, Deborah and her ex-husband, Jason's father, John, traveled from Pennsylvania to South Carolina to help search for their son. On April 21st, Jason's white 1990 Chevrolet Beretta was reported to police as being parked at Table Rock State Park in Pickens County, South Carolina, approximately 30 miles from the Clemson University campus. The park superintendent explained that they had not contacted authorities earlier, even though the car had been there since April 12th, because there was a long trail within the park that took a full week to complete. A sticker on Jason's car indicated he was a Clemson student, so staff assumed he might have been interested in tackling such a challenging hike and that he possessed the physical strength and skills to finish it. Even after a week had passed with the car still untouched, they believed its owner might simply have been too tired to drive home afterward and had gotten a ride back to campus, planning to return for the vehicle later. It was only on the 9th day that concern finally prompted them to notify the authorities, who quickly connected the car to the active missing person case. Investigators believe Jason entered the park sometime between 3 o'clock and 5 p.m. on Sunday, April 12th, the day after his last phone conversation with his mother. His fingerprints were found on the park ticket, confirming that he had been the one who drove the car there. Table Rock State Park covers thousands of acres, much of it wilderness. An extensive search was launched throughout the park and a nearby lake was even drained. Yet no trace of Jason was ever found despite the massive effort, which lasted more than 2 weeks. Police reported there were no signs of foul play either in the park or inside Jason's car. The day before he disappeared, Jason had withdrawn $20 from his bank account, and that account has never been touched since. In 2017, after years of agonizing uncertainty, Jason's parents made the painful decision to have him declared legally dead. John's health was declining, and Deborah had medical issues of her own. They hoped the legal process would allow them a chance to say a formal goodbye to their son before they passed away. The declaration was completed in January 2018, and a memorial marker was installed for Jason at Susquehanna Memorial Gardens in his hometown. Sadly, Jason's father, John, passed away in 2019. Even 25 years after his disappearance, investigative efforts to find Jason remain ongoing. In 2022, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released a new age-progressed image showing what Jason might look like today. Deborah had a bench installed in Jason's name at the Botanical Gardens at Clemson University. She travels there every year to sit on the bench, remember her son, and write him a letter as part of her personal way of coping with his disappearance. To this day, she still holds out hope that she will find answers about what became of her son within her lifetime. On November 20, 2006, at approximately 3 p.m., 2 women were walking along a path that wound through the marshy area directly behind the Golden Key Motel, one of a string of cheap flophouses lining Black Horse Pike in the West Atlantic City section of Egg Harbor Township, New Jersey. As they glanced down into the drainage ditch that ran behind the motel, they spotted a woman's body lying partially submerged in the water. They immediately called the police. When officers arrived and began searching the surrounding area, they made a horrifying discovery. The bodies of 3 additional women were also lying in the same drainage ditch. All 4 bodies were positioned along the ditch, spaced no more than 50 yards apart from one another. None of the victims had purses, wallets, or any form of identification with them. They were all fully clothed, yet every single one was missing her socks and shoes. Each body had been placed with the head pointing east, directly toward Atlantic City. Authorities soon came to the conclusion that all 4 women had been killed by the same perpetrator. The consistent orientation of the bodies and their close proximity to the eastbound lane of the Atlantic City Expressway quickly earned the unknown killer the nickname the Eastbound Strangler, though he was referred to by several other monikers as well. Based on the varying stages of decomposition visible on the 4 bodies, police determined that the victims had been murdered at different times. The first woman had been killed as early as 6 weeks before the bodies were discovered. The second victim was murdered roughly 2 weeks after the first. The third died approximately 1 week after the second, and the fourth was killed about 1 week after that, only a short time before the grim discovery on November 20th. The body that had initially drawn the police to the scene, and the most recently killed of the 4, belonged to 35-year-old Kim Raffo. Kim had grown up in the Canarsie neighborhood of Brooklyn. Both of her young parents had struggled with substance abuse, yet despite the difficulties at home, Kim had been a loving and happy child who was always smiling. As she entered adulthood, she appeared to be heading toward a far more stable life. She married her husband Hugh in 1989, and the couple moved to Florida to be near Kim's sister and her mother, who had divorced Kim's father in 1988. Hugh secured a solid job in construction, and together they purchased a 4-bedroom home in Pembroke Pines. Kim and Hugh welcomed a daughter in 1992 and a son in 1994. In addition to raising her own children, Kim also helped care for her sister's 2 children. She was actively involved with the PTA and Girl Scouts, and her next-door neighbor described Kim and her family as ideal neighbors. Kim's idyllic life eventually unraveled. For reasons her loved ones could never fully explain, something abruptly changed in 2001. According to her family, "I don't know if she just tired of being the one everyone always relied on," her sister Marie said shortly after Kim's death. "I don't know if she just got fed up with being supermom or the superwoman of the family. We don't know. I wish I could have had my final words with her." That same year, Kim enrolled in a cooking class at the Sheridan Technical Center in Hollywood, Florida. Through the class, she met a habitual drug user named Kenny and began an affair with him. When Kim's husband Hugh learned of the affair, he attacked Kenny with a baseball bat. Kim refused to end the relationship with Kenny or to give up the cocaine habit she was developing under his influence. As a result, Hugh took the children and left. He sold the family home and moved with the kids to Ocean City, New Jersey. Kim followed them to Atlantic City in order to be closer to her children, bringing Kenny with her. After another violent altercation between Hugh and Kenny, Kim and Hugh's children were placed in foster care. When Kim and Kenny first arrived in Atlantic City, both found steady employment at a restaurant inside the Taj Mahal casino. However, they quickly became immersed in the drug scene that was prevalent throughout the city. Kim's once social drug use escalated into a full-blown addiction to crack cocaine, intensified by her overwhelming guilt over no longer being with her children. Neither she nor Kenny could hold down a job any longer. As their habit worsened, Kenny turned to shoplifting, while Kim turned to sex work, selling herself on Pacific Avenue, known locally as the Track, just 1 block inland from the boardwalk. On September 9, 2006, Kim's estranged husband Hugh arrived in Atlantic City. He had been working construction jobs up and down the East Coast. Kenny was in jail at the time on a shoplifting charge. Hugh told his estranged wife that he was there to help her if she wanted to get her life back on track. When Hugh left Atlantic City, Kim went with him and stayed for several weeks at a motel in Jericho, New York on Long Island, while Hugh worked in the area. The couple did not reconcile, but Hugh still saw his estranged wife as a friend he wanted to help. After 5 weeks in New York, Kim told Hugh that she had unfinished business she needed to handle back in Atlantic City. She made plans to meet up with him again after 1 week before leaving for New Jersey, but she never returned. This had not been the first time Hugh had tried to help Kim get her life back on track, but unfortunately it would be the last. The last confirmed sightings of Kim alive occurred in the early hours of November 19th, the day before her body was found. She walked into Papa Joe's, a diner on Pacific Avenue, shortly after it opened at 2:30 a.m. According to Joseph Bacino, the owner of the diner who also knew Kim personally, she ordered her usual breakfast of 2 fried eggs, American cheese, and sausage on a Kaiser roll, along with a Mountain Dew. After she finished eating, Kim went outside and got into a black Nissan Maxima. A source who had been a high-ranking member of law enforcement working on the case early on later told NJ Advance Media, speaking under the condition of anonymity, that Kim had been with a client in a room at the Taj Mahal Hotel and Casino. She left the room around 5 a.m. to buy drugs, telling her client she would return. She never did. The client, a doctor from North Jersey, was identified through Kim's cell phone records. He was cleared by police because surveillance footage corroborated his account and showed him remaining at the hotel and in the casino. The post-mortem examination determined that Kim had died as a result of strangulation with some sort of rope or cord. Because of the decomposition, authorities could only state more broadly that the second-to-last woman killed had died of asphyxiation, with strangulation remaining a strong possibility. She was 23-year-old Tracy Ann Roberts from Bay, Delaware. Tracy had been an active and loving child whose favorite thing to do was spend time with her friends. Her life began to go off track when she was 14 and started experimenting with drugs and alcohol. She dropped out of high school at 16 and found a job as a telemarketer for a mortgage broker. She began dating one of her coworkers and gave birth to their daughter when she was 18. The baby's father was awarded primary custody when the child was 5 months old. Tracy then began taking steps to improve her life, enrolling in a trade school and training to become a medical assistant. She found a job at a doctor's office, and the Delaware Housing Authority helped her purchase a townhome. Tracy's boyfriend brought their daughter to live with her there. According to Tracy's mother, this was the happiest time of Tracy's life. That happy period soon ended, however, when the doctor's office where Tracy worked moved after she had been there for almost a year, leaving her without a job or any way to make her mortgage payments. Her relationship with her daughter's father ended, and her home went into foreclosure. Tracy began using cocaine with increasing frequency. She spent a few years moving between Delaware, Philadelphia, and South Jersey. She returned to Atlantic City for the last time in August of 2006, trying to escape an abusive relationship. She worked for a time as an exotic dancer until her drug use left her too thin and frail for club owners to want to employ her. She then turned to the streets and to sex work. Once social, Tracy became isolated and quiet, according to other sex workers she met during this time. Shortly before her death, Tracy had almost left Atlantic City. On November 8th, a man who had wanted to be her pimp had punched Tracy so forcefully in the neck that she began coughing up blood and had to be taken to a hospital. While she was there, she called her mother, Joyce, to ask her to come pick her up and bring her back to Delaware. Joyce made the 90-minute drive but found, when she reached the hospital, that she had arrived 5 minutes too late. Tracy had just checked herself out and left with 2 unidentified men. "We are good people who had a daughter who had a disease," Joyce Roberts said during an interview less than a month later after Tracy's body was found. She had a drug addiction. It was cocaine. She wasn't just a prostitute in Atlantic City. This was somebody's daughter. The cause of death for the other 2 victims could not be determined because of the advanced level of decay in their bodies by the time they were discovered. 42-year-old Barbara Brider, believed to be the second woman killed, had grown up in a loving and stable home in the suburbs of Philadelphia and spent summers with her family at the beaches of the Jersey Shore, not far from where her body was ultimately found. She was charming and witty and considered to be the smartest of her siblings, who often encouraged her to go on the game show Jeopardy, because she was always able to quickly shout out the right answers when she watched it, thanks to her knowledge of such a broad range of topics. Barbara's life changed dramatically when her father died suddenly. His loss tore her family apart and left Barbara in a deep depression. She studied at a community college before transferring to Penn State but left school after struggling to get through her first year there. She moved to the Jersey Shore for a fresh start and seemed to do well in her new life, holding down a series of steady waitressing jobs. When Barbara's mother opened the Santa Fe Trading Company, a small chain of stores selling Native American art, jewelry, and clothing, Barbara went to work for her, first at the shop on the Atlantic City boardwalk and eventually managing the business. However, when Barbara's mother decided to retire and sold the business, Barbara had to go back to waitressing. In 1997, Barbara achieved her lifelong goal of becoming a mother, giving birth to her daughter Dominique. However, when Dominique was 4, Barbara sent her to live with her sister Valerie in Florida. Dominique's father had become addicted to painkillers after he was prescribed them following back surgery many years earlier. Years before Dominique was born, Barbara had taken one of his pills to help with menstrual cramps, a small decision that would ultimately have dire and major implications. As the years went on, her own dependency grew, and when the couple was cut off by doctors and could no longer get the prescription medication, they eventually turned to heroin. While it was her escalating drug use that had led to Barbara needing to send her daughter to her sister, her heartbreak at being away from Dominique only encouraged her growing problem. Eventually, Valerie severely limited contact between Dominique and Barbara so as not to upset the child, because Barbara would sob uncontrollably at the end of their phone calls and cling to her at the end of their visits. Barbara ultimately agreed to give up custody of her daughter completely because it was what was best for Dominique, and Valerie's adoption of Dominique was finalized within weeks of Barbara's death. Dominique remained in Florida with her aunt, uncle, and 2 cousins. She was put into therapy and became an excellent student with plans to go to college. Barbara's drug use was also a means of self-medicating as she dealt with alleged domestic violence at the hands of Dominique's father. The relationship ended when he was sent to prison on drug possession and burglary charges. Around this time, Barbara started smoking crack and supporting herself through sex work. Barbara was last seen leaving a house she was staying at with a friend in Ventnor, New Jersey, on October 17th. Her 2 sisters tried to file a missing person report on her, but said police gave them the runaround after they discovered Barbara had a previous arrest for solicitation. "My sister didn't deserve to die the way she died and then to be thrown like a piece of trash in a muddy ditch," Barbara's sister Francine said after Barbara's body was found. "I hope they get the SOB that did this." The 4th body, believed to belong to the first woman killed, was so heavily decomposed that authorities had to rely on releasing descriptions of some of the tattoos still visible on it in order to identify the victim. She may have been killed as early as 6 weeks prior to the discovery of her body. Molly Dilts was just 20 years old at the time of her death. She was from the small mining town of Blacklick, Pennsylvania, where she grew up with not a lot of money but a lot of love from her family. Molly had been a warm and caring child who struggled as she faced hardships as a young adult. She had trouble coping with the deaths of her mother and her brother when she was a teenager. In response to the losses, she developed a rebellious streak which led to drinking, drug use, and a few minor run-ins with the law. She was enrolled in the special education program at Blairsville High School but frequently missed school and dropped out during her junior year. The courts sent her to rehab, but she did not remain sober after leaving. In June of 2005, Molly gave birth to her son Jeremiah. She willingly signed over custody of him to her father. Molly spent the year following Jeremiah's birth traveling between her hometown in western Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. She first arrived in Atlantic City in the summer of 2006. She came back to visit her family in Pennsylvania at the beginning of October and told them that things were starting to turn around. She still occasionally smoked marijuana but had stopped using any kind of hard drug. Her family last heard from her on October 7th, when she called them from a phone booth in Atlantic City. Problems plagued the investigation into the 4 murders from the very beginning. The water in the drainage ditch contaminated the bodies and washed away potential trace evidence. Police believed that the women had been killed elsewhere and their bodies had simply been disposed of in the drainage ditch, leaving investigators without primary crime scenes to examine. Furthermore, many of the similarities between the 4 victims had alternative explanations, calling into question their significance. 3 out of the 4 victims had previous arrests for solicitation. Molly Dilts had no such arrests, and her father was not convinced that she had ever turned to sex work. But other women working in the area reported that she had in the weeks before her death. While this may point to the killer being a client who found his victims by picking them up on the streets, the lives of the 4 women overlapped in other ways as well. They were all known to frequent several of the same motels, restaurants, and soup kitchens, providing a wide variety of overlapping locations in their lives where they also could have crossed paths with the person who killed them. Post-mortem examinations showed that the victims had various kinds of substances in their systems at the times of their deaths. Kim and Tracy had large amounts of cocaine, Molly had a large amount of alcohol, and Barbara had a potentially lethal amount of heroin. Each woman was known to abuse the substance found in her system, so it is unclear if they had acquired the drug on their own or if the killer had provided it to them in an effort to incapacitate them. Defensive wounds could not be found on any of the women's bodies. This is most significant in the case of Kim Raffo, whose body was found relatively quickly, so the lack of discernible defense wounds could not be attributed to advanced decomposition. The heads of all 4 victims were found pointed in the same direction, east. This led to speculation that the killer was making a statement about Atlantic City, as it was in that direction. Because the women had been found barefoot and facing the general direction of Mecca, rumors also circulated that a Muslim had been responsible for the murders, as Muslims say their daily prayers barefoot and facing Mecca. A Muslim man who was a convicted drug dealer and a friend of Kim Raffo was brought in by police for questioning but could never be tied to the murders. In addition, the positions of the heads could also potentially be alternatively explained by the pull of the current in the water in the ditch as it flowed out to the bay rather than by a deliberate choice made by the killer. The circumstance that appears least likely to have an alternative explanation is the fact that all 4 women were found barefoot, which some investigators believe may indicate that the killer had some sort of foot fetish. Several other sex workers have reported having clients with such an interest around the time of the murders. One of them, a woman named Denise, has come forward reporting a particularly concerning incident. A client of hers had been obsessed with her shoes to the point where she had given him a pair of them to keep. He was talking about some crazy stuff, she later told 48 Hours. He was talking about like really bizarre stuff like he's killed some people. The show brought in a sketch artist to develop a sketch with Denise's help. The client later sent Denise a Christmas card in which he referred to himself as the Riverman, feared to be a reference to the Green River Killer, who murdered sex workers in Washington state. The man was eventually identified and found to be a drifter. No direct links between him and the murders have been discovered. The Atlantic City Prosecutor's Office Major Crimes Unit, the Egg Harbor Township Police Department, the Atlantic City Police Department, the FBI, and the New Jersey State Police all worked on the investigation. They conducted interviews and questioned potential suspects, but have never identified a formal suspect in the case. A man who had been staying at the Golden Key Motel was reported to police by his ex-girlfriend after he evicted her from his house following an ongoing domestic dispute, and served time in prison after evidence of an unrelated crime was discovered during a search of his home. But the investigation has never led to any arrests for the murders. A potential major development in the case came 4 years after the 4 bodies were found. In December of 2010, 4 bodies belonging to women who had been involved in sex work were discovered wrapped in burlap along a remote stretch of Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach on Long Island. The similarities between the New York murders and the Atlantic City murders led to speculation that they may have been connected. Authorities in Suffolk County, New York, were in contact with the investigators working on the 2006 murders in Atlantic City. Several other bodies of individuals believed to have been killed by the same individual who took the lives of the 4 victims found near Gilgo Beach were discovered in the following year. But no concrete link to the Atlantic City cases was ever identified. In November 2016, near the 10th anniversary of the discovery of the 4 bodies, acting Atlantic County Prosecutor Diane M. Ruberton declined to say if her office believed the Atlantic City cases were connected to those in Long Island. The week before, however, the Suffolk County Police Department stated that they believed the cases on Long Island and the cases in West Atlantic City were not related. The Golden Key Motel remained a dangerous place with illegal activities in the years after the murders, along with many of its neighboring flophouses. It was severely damaged during Hurricane Sandy in 2012. Egg Harbor Township purchased several of the damaged motels in November of 2013 and demolished them in 2015 with hopes of redeveloping the area. In a statement released in 2018, Atlantic County Prosecutor Damon G. Tyner refused to describe the still unsolved murders as a cold case because the case is still being actively investigated by multiple agencies. In the same statement, Egg Harbor Township Police Chief Raymond Davis said, "As an original supervisory member of the investigative team assigned to this case, I can confirm that these victims are not forgotten. All member agencies involved in this investigation, local, county, state, and federal, remain diligent in our pursuit of the person or persons responsible. We urge anyone with information to contact law enforcement." 15 years after Kim Raffo, Molly Dilts, Barbara Brider, and Tracy Roberts were killed, their killer has still not been identified. Pamela Holopainen grew up in the South Porcupine neighborhood of Timmins, a mining town in northern Ontario. Her mother, Holly Cook, was Inuit, and her family was originally from Nunavut. Like many Indigenous individuals in Canada, Holly was sent to a boarding school. She arrived at the school at the age of 14, and a year later she became pregnant with Pamela's older sister, Vanessa Brousseau. Pamela was born 2 years after Vanessa. Holly did her best to actively raise her daughters in their Inuit culture and to teach them to embrace their heritage in their daily lives as much as possible. Since there were no other Inuit in Timmins, she was also active in the local Indigenous community. Holly would eventually become the president of the Timmins Native Friendship Center. Pamela and Vanessa were very close growing up and relied heavily on one another. They grew up in poverty and therefore had very few toys, so they used their imaginations to make up games and activities together. Pamela was outgoing and outspoken. She had a big personality, which was also reflected in how deeply she cared for others and the great lengths she would go to in order to help anyone who needed anything. Pamela left school prior to graduating high school so she could go to work. Following a brief stint as a waitress, she found a job in a call center where she excelled. By 2003, 22-year-old Pamela had a common-law spouse with whom she had 2 sons. She was a devoted mother. Pamela and Vanessa remained close as adults, and it was common for them to speak multiple times a day. On December 13, 2003, Pamela asked Vanessa if she could babysit her 2 boys that night. Vanessa was unable to, so Pamela made other arrangements. Vanessa went to Pamela's house on December 15th, but no one was home. She continued visiting the house over the next few days to see her sister and drop off Christmas presents for her nephews. but no one was ever at the house. Vanessa assumed that they had gone to spend Christmas with Pamela's common-law spouse's family. Pamela did not call Vanessa on Christmas Day, which Vanessa was very upset about. On December 26th, Vanessa was able to speak with Pamela's landlord. They had not seen the family either. At this point, Vanessa was still under the assumption that her sister was with her common-law spouse's family and was simply failing to call her. Vanessa learned that she was wrong on New Year's Eve. That day, Vanessa and her mother were at a bingo hall when a woman came up to them and asked if they had heard about Pamela. They said they had not, and the woman told them that Pamela had left her common-law spouse. Vanessa and Holly then asked where Pamela's children were. They were still with their father. This was an immediate indication that something was not right to Vanessa and Holly. It was conceivable that Pamela would leave her spouse. There was not even a remote possibility, however, that Pamela would go anywhere without her sons. Vanessa and Holly went to the police to report Pamela missing. While they made the report as soon as they realized that something was wrong, it had been more than 2 weeks since anyone had seen Pamela. She had attended a house party on the evening of December 13th and had left it in the early morning hours of the 14th after reportedly getting into an argument with her common-law spouse and saying she would walk home. Police were not concerned about Pamela's disappearance, telling Vanessa and Holly that Pamela was probably out drinking and would reappear in a few days. A conclusion with no supporting evidence. Vanessa and Holly, understandably frustrated by this disregard for Pamela's well-being, began their own search, organizing friends and family members to create and distribute flyers and to search for Pamela. For months after Pamela went missing, when police finally began investigating Pamela's disappearance, they told her family that they believed Pamela was a sex worker in Hamilton, Ontario. They supported this claim with 2 nude pictures Pamela had taken of herself, presumably for her common-law spouse, that had been found on her personal computer. The case was eventually taken over by the Ontario Provincial Police, but the investigator assigned to the case faced allegations of attempted murder and arson and spent time in jail in 2013. The case was sent back to police in Timmins, who told Pamela's sister Vanessa that the case was not active. Pamela's mother, Holly, passed away on December 31, 2007, exactly 4 years to the day after she reported her daughter missing to police. Vanessa Brousseau continues to advocate and search for her sister. She is active on social media, sharing her sister's story as well as stories of the challenges facing Indigenous people in Canada. George Nelson Shaw Sr. was born in West Virginia in October 1936. He met his wife, Norma, in 1959, and their first date took place at the Florida State Fair on Valentine's Day. Just a few months later, in June, they married. Their union lasted nearly 59 years and gave them 3 children, 9 grandchildren, and 23 great-grandchildren. George served as a deacon at his church and found joy in hunting, reading, and gardening. He spent 28 years in the United States Air Force, retiring as a senior master sergeant. After leaving the military, he worked for 8 more years at the Lewis A. Johnson Medical Center, a Veterans Administration hospital in Clarksburg, West Virginia. In 2018, George returned to that same hospital, this time as a patient. He was suffering from dementia but was not in critical condition. Just 2 weeks earlier, he had been out bowling with his league. He was admitted on March 22, 2018, because of low blood pressure and dehydration. Since his condition was not considered life-threatening, he was placed on floor 3A in the medical surgical wing rather than in the intensive care unit. After receiving fluids, George's health improved quickly, and he was soon able to walk the hospital halls. Then, for days into his stay, his condition took a sudden and dramatic turn. He suffered an unexplained hypoglycemic event. His blood sugar level crashed for no identifiable medical reason. The staff managed to bring his levels back up, but they crashed again. From that point on, George's health spiraled. In his final days, he appeared trapped inside his own body, unable to care for himself or communicate with his family. He passed away on April 10, 2018, at the age of 81. His family found the abruptness of his death suspicious and insisted on an autopsy. The medical examiner noted evidence of heart disease and listed the cause of death as congestive heart failure. Several months later, however, Officials asked the family for permission to exhume George's body and send it to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware for a second examination. The family agreed. On January 16, 2019, that second autopsy confirmed the presence of heart disease, but it was not the cause of death. Investigators discovered 4 unexplained injection marks on George's body. Tissue samples from around those sites tested positive for insulin. George had never been diabetic and had never been prescribed insulin. The Armed Forces medical examiner ruled the manner of death a homicide caused by the administration of exogenous insulin, meaning someone had intentionally injected him with medically unnecessary insulin to drive his blood sugar dangerously low, ultimately leading to his death. On the very same day George Shaw was admitted, 84-year-old Archie Dale Edgell arrived on the same floor of the same hospital. Archie was an Army veteran who had served during the Korean War. He was a gifted musician who could play nearly any instrument he picked up. He had also served as a street water commissioner for the city of Salem, West Virginia, for several years. Married to his wife Frances for more than 60 years, he and Frances raised 5 children and went on to have numerous grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Archie had been sent to the Johnson Medical Center by his primary care physician because of issues related to his dementia. While the federally run VA hospital evaluated whether his condition had progressed enough to require admission to the nearby West Virginia Veterans Nursing Facility, Archie was not in serious condition when he arrived. He had walked into the building on his own. He did have type 2 diabetes, so his blood sugar was checked on admission and registered a slightly elevated 165. No insulin was given to lower it. Yet shortly after admission, Archie's blood sugar plummeted into the 20s and 30s with no explanation. The medications he normally took to control his diabetes had been held during his hospital stay, and instead he was given dextrose and other treatments to raise his levels. Despite those efforts, Archie passed away on March 26, 2018, just 4 days after he arrived. His medical team had no explanation for the sudden hypoglycemia or for his death, and he was buried without further investigation. His family had sensed something was wrong from the beginning. When investigators visited them in November 2018 to discuss exhuming his body for additional testing, Archie's son Steve's first words were, "They killed my father, didn't they?" Archie's wife Frances lived long enough to learn that her husband's death was being treated as suspicious, but she passed away in April 2019, just 2 months before the final report on his remains was released. Her son believed she died of a broken heart. The examination of Archie's body revealed several unexplained injection sites, and tissue around those marks tested positive for insulin, just as in George Shaw's case. The new autopsy report described the findings as suspicious for unprescribed exogenous insulin administration. Investigators told both families that numerous other veteran deaths at the Johnson Medical Center were now under review. The full scale of the problem did not become public until August 2019, when the daughter of another veteran submitted a formal claim to the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. Felix Kirk McDermott was a Vietnam War veteran who had retired from the Army as a sergeant, then worked as a truck driver and served in the Pennsylvania Army National Guard. His daughter Melanie later described him as a proud Army veteran and an ornery but helpful character who would lend a hand to anyone. At 82, Kirk had been admitted on April 6, 2018, with pneumonia. He also had dementia and a physical impairment from a previous stroke. His health initially improved, but on the morning of April 9th, he suddenly developed severe shortness of breath. Blood tests revealed critically low blood sugar. Medical staff could not raise his levels, and Kirk died around 9 a.m. Hospital personnel never explained to the family that he had suffered an unexplained hypoglycemic event. Months later, the family was contacted and told that Kirk's death might not have been from natural causes. His remains were exhumed and sent to Dover Air Force Base. Once again, unexplained injection marks were found, and testing confirmed insulin at those sites. Kirk had never had diabetes and had never been prescribed insulin. The deputy medical examiner ruled the death a homicide. Someone had deliberately injected him with insulin to kill him. When the family was first notified, they were also told that 9 or 10 other veterans had died under similar suspicious circumstances on that same floor prior to Kirk's death. According to the claim later filed by Kirk's family, if the medical examiner's conclusion was correct, Felix Kirk McDermott had been murdered while under the care of the Lewis A. Johnson VA Medical Center. The hospital had been aware of the earlier suspicious injections yet had taken no effective action to stop them, allowing more deaths to occur. Prosecutors would eventually determine that as many as 20 murders carried out through unauthorized insulin injections had taken place at the hospital over nearly a year, from July 2017 to June 2018. By the time Melanie and her family filed their claim, a person of interest had already been identified, though no charges had been filed yet and the name was not released publicly. That person had been pinpointed in the earliest days of the investigation, which began in June 2018, nearly a year after the first suspicious deaths. For the previous 11 months, various staff members had privately discussed how strange it was that elderly male patients kept experiencing unexplained hypoglycemic episodes, often in the early morning hours, but no one had formally reported their concerns. Even as the deaths increased in frequency in early 2018, the issue remained unaddressed. Finally, in June 2018, a doctor known publicly only as Hospitalist B met with the hospital's Associate Chief of Staff after speaking with other physicians. The Associate Chief of Staff's response reflected the general attitude of most employees. The events were probably medically based and did not need to be reported. Hospitalist B insisted that something criminal might be happening. On June 28th, the Veterans Affairs Office of the Inspector General was contacted. The FBI joined the next day, and the U.S. Attorney's Office joined a week later. An extensive investigation followed. Initially, authorities examined 8 cases doctors had flagged in hopes of quickly identifying a suspect and preventing further harm. They soon narrowed the focus. Only 3 hospital employees had been on duty in the relevant time windows just before the suspicious hypoglycemic events. Only one of those 3 had worked on floor 3A, where every suspicious death had occurred. Electronic records proved the other 2 had been elsewhere in the hospital at the critical times. That left a single person of interest. The individual remained on staff temporarily but was immediately removed from patient care duties on July 5, 2018. In March 2019, the person was terminated for providing dishonest answers during interviews related to the investigation. The person of interest was 46-year-old Rita Mays. She was not arrested until July 14, 2020, 2 years after the investigation opened, when she appeared in federal court and pleaded guilty to 7 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of assault with intent to commit murder. The assault charge involved 92-year-old Navy veteran Russell R. Posey, a World War II veteran. Although Mays admitted to injecting him with insulin, prosecutors determined they lacked sufficient medical evidence to prove the injection directly caused his death. While roughly 20 deaths had been deemed suspicious, prosecutors concluded they could not meet the legal standard to charge Mays in every case. In addition to George Shaw, Archie Edgell, and Kirk McDermott, Mays confessed to murdering 4 other veterans with insulin injections. 82-year-old Robert Edge Sr., a kind and gentle Navy veteran of the Korean War who could build almost anything. 96-year-old William Holloway, an Army veteran of World War II who had enlisted before turning 18 with his father's permission. 89-year-old Robert Lee Kozel Sr., an Army field artillery parachutist who loved music, church, fixing things, and playing the harmonica. And 88-year-old Raymond Golden, an Army and Air Force veteran who had worked as a mail carrier and enjoyed bowling, fishing, and woodworking. Rita Mays herself was a veteran. She had served in the Army National Guard from November 2000 to April 2001, and again from February 2003 to May 2004, including a deployment to Iraq and Kuwait in a non-combat role repairing chemical equipment. She was discharged in October 2006. In 2015, she was hired as a nursing assistant at the Johnson Medical Center and assigned to the night shift on floor 3A of the Medical Surgical Unit, the same unit where all the suspicious deaths occurred. A later investigation revealed multiple systemic failures that had allowed Mays to kill so many patients without detection. The first failure happened during her hiring process. Before joining the VA hospital, she had worked for 3 years at a group home for adults with disabilities, rising from caregiver to residential manager. She had left that job on good terms. but her previous employment had been as a corrections officer at the North Central Regional Jail from August 2005 to September 2012. During that time, inmates had accused her of using excessive force. She and other officers were named in a 2013 federal lawsuit alleging she had helped restrain an inmate so another officer could stomp on his head, then spat in the inmate's face and threatened him. All defendants denied the claims, and a judge dismissed the suit. The VA hospital never learned of these allegations because it failed to conduct the full background and employment checks required for federal patient care positions. Had officials known, Mays almost certainly would not have been hired, and the hospital would have had grounds to terminate her during her probationary period, which ended in September 2016, months before the first murder. Another missed opportunity came in December 2016, when Mays was nominated by her supervisor for Nursing Assistant of the Year as part of the VA Secretary's Awards for Excellence in Nursing. The award carried a $500 prize and required a security check. The person responsible for the check simply marked it complete and favorable without actually performing it. Mays received the award in September 2017, just months after her first murder. As a nursing assistant, Mays was not licensed or trained to administer medications. Her duties were limited to helping patients with daily activities such as eating and bathing, monitoring vital signs, and sitting with patients who needed constant supervision. Yet she had been the nursing assistant assigned to sit with several of the murdered men shortly before their unexplained hypoglycemic events. Another detail that heightened investigators' suspicions. Mays was interviewed by investigators 3 times. In the first interview, she complained extensively about her job, saying she was often asked to work in other areas or perform tasks she considered beneath her. She denied any involvement in the deaths. Hospital records show that immediately afterward, she returned to her workstation and began searching for a new job. Although the case against her was entirely circumstantial, there were no fingerprints, no insulin bottles or syringes recovered, no security cameras in medication areas, and no locked storage. The evidence continued to mount. A review of her social media accounts revealed posts in which she complained about patients and joked about medically restraining them. In Facebook messages, she griped about having to deliver medications while doctors fought to save George Shaw's life. Her internet search history showed she had researched female serial killers and the number of victims each had claimed, and she had watched a Netflix series titled Nurses Who Kill. One episode featured a nurse who murdered patients with insulin, information that would have shown a non-medically trained person like Mays how insulin could be used as a weapon. Mays was married, but her husband was incarcerated on child pornography charges at the time. Their morning phone calls after her night shifts were recorded. In one call the morning after a hypoglycemic event, she complained about the patient she had been assigned to watch and said she had wanted to strangle him. In another, she griped that her arms were sore from performing chest compressions while trying to revive a victim. She was upset the patient's family had not signed a do not resuscitate order. She told her husband that if the staff had simply done nothing when the patient's blood sugar dropped to 30, he would have just fallen asleep and not woken up. A remark authorities found odd coming from someone without formal medical training. During her second and third interviews, Mays largely shut down, leaving long stretches of silence on the recordings. In the third interview, she finally acknowledged that the evidence pointed to her. Afterward, she went to the courthouse to request a court-appointed attorney. Investigators then issued a target letter formally naming her, which allowed her to receive 3 court-appointed lawyers. Negotiations began for a plea deal. The families of the victims were consulted and agreed that Mays should plead guilty rather than face trial. On May 11, 2021, Mays was sentenced. Her attorneys asked for 30 years, citing her difficult childhood and post-traumatic stress disorder stemming from a sexual assault she suffered while in the military. Mays addressed the court, "I don't ask anyone for forgiveness because I don't think I could forgive anyone for doing what I did. I can only say that I'm sorry for the pain I caused the families and my family." Many victims' relatives spoke, describing their loved ones and the lasting impact of their loss. Robert Edge Jr. told Mays, "Growing up, he was my hero. He took care of me when I was little, and when it was time for me to take care of him, you took that away from me." Melanie Proctor, daughter of Kirk McDermott, said, You took some of the greatest men of our time and preyed on them when they were at their weakest, and for that you are a coward. U.S. District Judge Thomas C. Klee rejected the request for leniency. He noted that he regularly saw people in his courtroom who had endured difficult childhoods or suffered from PTSD, yet none of them became serial killers. Addressing Mays, he said, "Your counsel made the point that you shouldn't be considered a monster. Respectfully, I disagree with that. You are the worst kind. You're the monster that no one sees coming." He sentenced her to 7 life sentences, 1 for each murder, plus 20 years for the assault charge. He recommended she serve her time at the Federal Medical Center Carswell in Fort Worth, Texas, for specialized mental health treatment, but she was ultimately sent to the Federal Correctional Institution Aliceville, a low-security facility in Alabama. While Mays's victims received justice, their families were still left without a clear motive. After entering her guilty pleas, Mays spoke with investigators and offered 2 explanations. The first, that she believed she was showing mercy by letting the men pass gently, was contradicted by the facts. None of the victims had been near death. Their conditions had stabilized or improved, and many were close to discharge. Instead of sparing them suffering, her injections caused hours or days of agony. Agitation, loss of motor control, cold sweats, difficulty breathing, and other severe symptoms. She even injected some victims more than once, after medical staff had managed to stabilize them. The second reason she gave appeared more credible. The sense of control the killings gave her amid chaos in her personal life and at work. Her husband was in prison, and she had repeatedly complained about the menial tasks of her job and about caring for dementia patients, exactly the population among her victims. Although responsibility for the crimes rested with Rita Mays, a 100-page report released by the Department of Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General on the day of her sentencing detailed how serious and pervasive clinical and administrative failures at the Johnson Medical Center had enabled her actions to go undetected for so long. Medication storage and inventory systems were inadequate. The pharmacy did not use the required VA tracking system, supply rooms and carts were left unlocked, and there were no security cameras in medication areas. As a result, Mays could obtain insulin freely even though she was not authorized to handle or administer any medications. The excessive use of drugs to counteract low blood sugar also went unnoticed. 7 of her confirmed victims never received proper testing to determine the cause of their hypoglycemia, and when George Shaw's family demanded further testing, doctors ordered the wrong test. Staff training was deficient. The employee responsible for patient safety had never instructed personnel on what kinds of incidents needed to be reported. The hospital's computer system sometimes failed to enter overnight blood sugar readings into patient charts for doctors to review the next morning. Leadership at every level had missed opportunities that could have stopped the crime spree earlier. The report issued 14 recommendations to improve patient safety. The VA stated that all would be implemented by March 2022. By the time of Mays' sentencing, the Veterans Administration had reached tentative financial settlements with the families of the victims, totaling more than $5 million. The money, however, could not erase the grief or the sense of betrayal. As Melanie Proctor, Kirk McDermott's daughter, said, "I'm always going to feel guilty about this. I thought I had my dad someplace safe." The families had trusted the hospital to protect the very veterans who had once protected the country, only to discover that the system meant to care for them had failed them in the most devastating way possible. Patricia Schmidt, who was affectionately known by the nickname Susie, lived together with her family in the seaside suburb of Seacliff, situated just south of Adelaide in the state of South Australia. This was back in the month of December in the year 1971. At that time, the 16-year-old Susie had only recently completed her final leaving examinations at Seacom High School a mere few weeks earlier. From a young age, Susie had held onto a vivid dream of one day working as an airline hostess, flying off to exciting destinations around the world. In the meantime, while she saved up and planned for her future, she had accepted a temporary position at the Burger King restaurant located in Darlington. The job was specifically chosen so that she could earn extra money to buy thoughtful Christmas presents for every member of her family. Susie's 10-year-old brother, Frank, had already gone out and purchased a special gift for his big sister, which he had carefully wrapped and placed beneath the family's Christmas tree in eager anticipation. Tragically, Susie would never have the chance to open that present or share in the holiday joy with her loved ones. Susie had recently begun requesting late-night shifts at work because those hours came with higher pay rates, which would help her reach her savings goals even faster. Friday, December 17, 1971, marked only the second time she had ever worked one of those late shifts. That evening, Susie's father, Werner Schmidt, dropped her off at the home of her close friend Frida at approximately 6 p.m. on his way to the local German club, where he held a part-time job as a barman. Around 8:30 p.m., Susie and Frida walked together to the Burger King so that Susie could begin her shift. Before Frida headed home, Susie told her friend that she would see her again the next day. Susie finished her work duties around 1:45 a.m. on the morning of December 18th. Her father had planned to pick her up on his way home from the club, but he ended up running about 10 minutes behind schedule. Rather than wait any longer in the dark, Susie decided to set off walking toward home on her own. Reflecting on that brief delay years later, Werner Schmidt would tell members of the press with deep regret, "A few minutes could have made all the difference. I might have saved my daughter's life." Susie never made it back to the family home that night. Her worried father reported her missing at 9:30 a.m. the following morning, less than 8 hours after she had last been seen leaving work. That same evening, around 6:30 p.m., an off-duty police officer happened to be driving through the area of Howlett Cove when something unusual caught his eye among the tall grass lining the roadside. As he pulled over and approached for a closer look, he realized with horror that what he had spotted was the body of a young woman. It was Susie Schmidt. When rescuers and investigators reached her, Susie was found wearing nothing except her boots. Her bra was discovered hanging from a nearby fence post, while her jumper and coat had been carefully draped over her body, almost as if someone had attempted to cover her after the fact. The kangaroo skin purse she had been carrying with her that night was never located despite extensive searches. Forensic evidence at the scene clearly indicated that Susie had been sexually assaulted before she was murdered, and the severely battered condition of her body left no doubt that she had endured a violent and brutal death. Susie was laid to rest beside her mother, who had passed away 5 years earlier. From the very beginning, police investigators theorized that Susie may have accepted a ride home from the person who ultimately killed her. They had reason to consider this possibility because Susie had confided in a friend about an unsettling encounter just a few days earlier. On Tuesday, December 14th, after working her very first late-night shift, she had accepted a lift from an unattractive man who appeared to be around 30 years old and who suffered from severe acne. Once Susie was inside his car, the man suggested they take a detour for a drive through the Adelaide Hills, but Susie firmly refused. He then began heading in the direction of Howlett Cove instead of taking her straight home, prompting Susie to demand that he turn around and drive her directly back to her residence, which he eventually did. Authorities could not determine with certainty whether this same individual might have offered Susie a ride again on the fatal night of December 17th, or whether he could have played any role in her killing. They also remained unsure if Susie had willingly climbed into a vehicle with someone she knew or trusted, or if she had been forcibly abducted while walking home alone. Despite the uncertainty surrounding exactly how the killer encountered Susie, investigators did possess several tangible pieces of physical evidence recovered from the crime scene. Among these clues were microscopic metal filings consistent with those produced during key-cutting operations, as well as tiny particles that could have originated from a shoe repair business. There were also byproducts typically left behind by welding work, along with small fragments of electrical waste that matched materials used at Phillips Industries, a factory located in the nearby suburb of Henley Beach at the time. Additionally, forensic teams found flakes of iridescent blue paint that appeared to have come from a 1971 model Holden Monero, and other small paint chips that were pink on one side and white on the other. Although detectives pursued every one of these leads diligently in the weeks and months that followed, none of them immediately cracked the case or led to an arrest. It would take many decades before modern forensic technology could be applied more effectively to the evidence preserved from the scene. In December of 2021, on the solemn occasion of the 50th anniversary of Susie's murder, South Australia Police launched a fresh public appeal for information and announced what they described as a significant breakthrough that brought them closer to solving the case than at any previous point in the investigation. During a new and more thorough examination of the clothing that had been found with Susie's body, forensic scientists had successfully recovered DNA belonging to multiple men. So far, only one of the two distinct DNA profiles identified on the clothing had been fully developed into a usable genetic profile. Investigators immediately began using this profile in an attempt to identify at least one of the men believed to have been responsible for the sexual assault. The profile was uploaded to the National DNA database, but it did not produce any direct matches among known offenders. Police then turned to the more advanced technique of familial searching, which has so far identified 8 potential relatives of the unknown suspect. Although this represents a major step forward, the painstaking process of constructing detailed family trees and obtaining DNA samples from every potential match is expected to take considerable time. In the meantime, authorities continue to urge anyone with information to come forward with the name of a possible suspect so that a direct DNA comparison can be conducted, which could potentially resolve the case within just a few weeks. A substantial reward of up to $1 million has been offered to encourage tips that might finally bring justice for Susie. For Susie's younger brother Frank, these latest developments have rekindled a long-dormant sense of optimism after decades of waiting and wondering. In a heartfelt statement, Frank expressed, "You're better off having some hope and being disappointed than having no hope at all."